much. It is fabulous to be here, and I'm super excited to share a little bit about the science of happiness. As promised, you're gonna get a whole Ivy League class, and it's gonna be squished down to just a half hour, which is great, because the half-hour version, we don't make you take the SAT, or we don't make you pay for the Yale tuition or anything like that. You just get it really cheaply. But what I was gonna start with was first how I got interested in this idea of how we can build resilience and how we can use scientific tools to figure out how we can do that. But then I'm gonna spend most of my time giving you, again, this very short version of the class. And since it's later in the afternoon, especially for some of you who might have flown here from the East Coast, we're gonna do it in a little bit of a listicle version. You're gonna get the top 7 tips that the science shares about how you can build resilience as a nonprofit leader. But first off, how did I get interested in this stuff? As mentioned, I'm a faculty member over at Yale University. I've been teaching there for over 2 decades. But in the last couple years, I took on a new role on campus. I became what's called the head of college. That meant that I lived on campus with students. I got really kind of close and personal to students, saw them in the dining hall, saw them in the coffee shops. And I honestly didn't like what I was seeing, but as I was seeing the college student mental health crisis up close and personal, where right now nationally among college students, more than 40% of college students report being too depressed to function most days. Right now nationally, more than 60% of college students say they're overwhelmingly anxious to the point that they can't do their work. Right? This was a real crisis I was seeing. And so I wanted to do something about it. I was there in this community kind of wanting to help. And my field of psychology actually has lots of strategies we can use to decrease stress, to promote resilience, to fight burnout, and so on. And so I said, well, why don't I put a whole new class together? I'll just like stick everything that my field has to say into a whole new class for Yale students. I called it something cool, so it'd sort of pop out of the course catalog. I called it Psychology and the Good Life, which hopefully sounded fun, had the Riz, as I just learned, from the last session, right? But I really wanted students to notice it, right? But I thought it was a new class on campus. I figured, 20 or 30 students would take it. You sort of heard the epilogue to the story already. It was a little bit more than 20 or 30 students. A quarter of the entire student body showed up, which I actually think bracketed is very humbling and cool. It means our young people don't like this crisis of feeling so burnt out and stressed out, and I think they really wanted an evidence-based approach to kind of fixing it. But if you were kind of nerdily paying attention to that syllabus that I flashed up so quickly, you might have noticed that this story started all the way back in 2018, where I think, frankly, it was sort of prescient to be talking about mental health and burnout and all these things, right? Fast forward to 2025, and I think especially in a room with a bunch of nonprofit leaders, I can say, it's been rough. Like, it's been a bit of a dumpster fire when it comes to our collective mental health, right? We can pick our reason, right? It's worth remembering that we just came out of an unprecedented global pandemic that probably affected a lot of your funding, a lot of your industries, a lot of the causes that you pay attention to. We're in a changing economic climate. We're in a changing, physical climate. There's a lot of stuff going on. And it's worth noting that it's normative in the mess that this is to feel burned out. It's normative to feel stressed. It's normative to be experiencing frustration and a whole host of other negative emotions. That's what you're supposed to feel when the world is on fire. But that's not a good thing to feel if you want to be making progress in all the important work that you're doing. And so what I want to talk about today is, given the realities that we're really facing in 2025, how can we become a little bit happier? How can we feel less burned out? How can we feel less stressed? How can we be resilient leaders in the face of the troubling reality that we all face? That's my task in the next half hour, big thing that we've been asked to do. But we're gonna get through it, and we're gonna get through it in the easy listicle version. As I mentioned, I'm gonna go through the top 7 insights that I think we get from the science of happiness. Starting with the most important one. This is the one you have to kind of buy into if you really wanna become a resilient leader. And it is the insight that if you want to perform well, if you want to solve the important problems that so many of your organizations are taking on, you actually have to focus on happiness first. And this is something I think that we get very wrong when we think about our work. Many of you are taking on incredibly difficult, tough, thorny problems, important problems, and you think, well, if I could just make some headway into succeeding at those things, if my organization could succeed, if I could perform well, we'll do good work, and then I can rest and be happy, right? You don't think of the opposite causal arrow. What if I focused on my self-care? What if I took care of myself? What if I invested in positive emotions? That would get me to perform better and then solve all the problems that I want to solve. We don't think the causal arrow goes that way, but if you look at what the research shows, there's lots of reason to suspect that that's the way it works, that focusing on your self-care and your positive emotion first will actually make you perform better. How do we know this? Well, we know this from lots of studies that have looked at the kinds of things that predict the bottom line. Later on here, I'm going to be talking up here with Meg from LinkedIn. We think a lot about what are the kinds of things we need to get a good job, right? We want all those LinkedIn skills on our resume. We don't think that one of the things we should pay attention to get a job is our positive emotion. But that's what researchers like Ed Diener and his colleagues were interested in. He asked, does having positive emotion at time 1 predict you getting job obtainment, getting a good job you like, and getting a higher salary later on? So he measured students' cheerfulness at age 18, standard survey that we use to measure cheerfulness, and he used that to predict not whether or not those 18-year-olds got a job that they wanted, but whether those 18-year-olds got a job at age 27, and then later at age 35. And what he finds is the most cheerful 18-year-olds were the ones who had the best job obtainment. They were also the ones who were making the most money. This is another spot where we get happiness wrong. We think, if I get lots of money, then I'll feel happier. We don't often think, if I could boost my mood and feel happier, that would lead to lots of money. But in fact, study after study shows that that seems to be the case. Happier at time 1 leads to more money at time 2. Now you could ask, why is that? Like, are our HR organizations paying the happy people more? Like, we should get on, that seems wrong, like we should fix that. No, the reason is one that makes sense, which is that if you are happier, if you experience more cheerfulness, if you experience a positive mood, you actually just think more innovatively. One of my favorite studies that tested this came from the medical domain. Researchers bring doctors into the lab, medical doctors, and give them a kind of tough medical diagnosis problem. Some of you are my age, so you might remember that TV show like House MD, where you had those like weird diagnoses. Or some of you are older than me, so you might remember Quincy MD. I'm not gonna call you out, but these there's like weird doctor problems, right? That's what these MDs were given. But half of the doctors, before they got the problem, were put in a good mood first. They just watched some silly cat videos online, so they're kind of laughing and in a good mood, then they get the problem. What do the researchers find? The doctors who were put in the good mood first were the ones who came up with the correct, often very innovative solution. And in some ways, you didn't need me to tell you this finding, right? Think of the last time you were in the opposite of a good mood, when you were just overwhelmed, when everything just felt like too much. Were you thinking creatively and coming up with your next big new idea? No, you were triaging, you were just getting stuff off your plate, you were narrowed in. When we are in a positive mood, we can think a little bit more expansively. And that's the kind of thing we need for resilient leadership, right? And so study after study shows that we get this causal arrow wrong. It's not the case, even though we kind of think it is, that if you just grind and kill yourself to fight these problems, that's the best way to perform. No, what the data shows is you might be leaving good performance on the table by not taking care of yourself. To take care of yourself first, promote positive emotions, focus on your happiness, do that first, you'll be coming up with the innovations and all the kind of great strategies that you need to do your work. And so that's one of the reasons I often start lots of my talks like this. I think we need to put our own self-care, our own happiness, our own positive emotions front and center. But then that raises a question, which is like, how do we do that? How do we do that in the real world that we're facing, where it's normative to be upset about some of the stuff that's happening out there? That's what the rest of the 7 tips are about. Starting with top insight number 2, if you really want to put your happiness first, you need to focus on becoming a little bit more social. Pretty much every study in the field of positive psychology, this field that I work in, shows that social people are more happy. If you do kind of time budget studies, you find that people who hang out with other humans more often are happier. If you spend more time with your friends and family member, you're happier. And even if you do experiments where you force people who don't feel like being social to be a little bit more social, they wind up experiencing more positive emotion, even introverts, right? Just being social seems to matter for our happiness. And that can be tough when we're feeling overwhelmed to put more of that social connection in, but that's when it's needed the most. But it's not just the act of hanging out with other people that seems to matter. It also is doing good for other people that matters. And this is where I feel like I'm really preaching to the choir. So many of your organizations are out there doing mission-driven work, but in the mix of things, you can kind of forget that, right? But the research shows that the act of doing nice things for others winds up making us feel happier. Controlled for income people who donate more money to charities wind up being happier than those that don't, right? This is not something that's kind of part of the public consciousness. I think we know it's good to do nice things for other people, but when we think of the kinds of things that make us happy, we often focus on self-care, treat yourself, self. My students get like little pillows in their college dorm room that say stuff like this, and I find this really frustrating because the research really shows it's just the opposite. If we want to be happier, we should focus on other people, not ourselves. How do we know this? Again, from studies that force people who might not even be thinking about doing something nice for somebody else to do something nice for somebody else, and they wind up happier. One of my favorite studies on this comes from just up the road at the University of British Columbia. Researchers Elizabeth Dunn and her colleagues did this study where they walk up to college students on the street, hand them some money. This is a very fun study for college students to be in, by the way. It's like, oh my gosh, get some money. They say, hey, here's 20 bucks, but here's how to spend it. You either have to spend it to do something to treat yourself, do something nice for yourself, or you have to spend it to help someone else, help a friend, donate it to a charity, a cause you care about, has to go to somebody else. She calls these students later in the day. What does she find? The ones that spent the money on other people are happier at the end of the day and even at the end of the week. And so that's top insight number one. If we want to be happier, we got to get out of our heads that it's just about us. We need to remember that it's about other people, connecting with other people, and doing good for other people too. And I think for so many of you in this room, that involves just reminding yourself and reframing the work that you're doing as being this insight right here. Top insight number two. Top insight number three is another way we can change our behaviors to feel happier. It's that we gotta focus on healthy habits. We gotta remember that our minds, our mental health is connected to our bodies and our physical health. We need to do the stuff that's good for our bodies. What do I mean? Simple things like exercising and moving your body, right? Studies, meta-analytic studies, which are studies of studies, show that a half hour of cardio every day can be as effective at reducing symptoms of depression as taking an antidepressant medication. There's similar results for anxiety. Your psychiatrist should be prescribing, hey, get to the gym and hop on the treadmill for a half hour, because sometimes it's more effective. We forget that, but it is. But for the folks in this room, you all look pretty fit that I can see, so maybe you all are doing this. Different healthy habit that I think my experience with nonprofit leaders suggests that they need a little bit more of is this. This, everyone, is sleep. That is what it looks like. It doesn't look like this, where you go into office and you're kind of falling asleep. Sleep matters so much for our mental health, so much that I'm gonna nerd out and just show you one graph so you can see how powerful this is. This is a study by Dinges and colleagues that looked at the importance of getting robust sleep in college students. So they bring college students into the lab and test their mood after 3 different sleep conditions. First, the nice sleep condition. You get to sleep a normal amount. Normal, what we're supposed to be getting, by the way, is 7 to 8 hours a night. You get that for 2 days. The not so nice thing is that the days after that, you get deprived sleep. You only get to sleep about 5 hours a night. This is where my poor college students are much less polite than you. They start laughing because they think 5 hours a night is a good amount of sleep. I actually think we could solve all those bad mental health statistics in our young people that I talked about earlier just by getting them to sleep, but you'll see why in this study. But these aren't evil researchers. They end the experiment kind of bringing the subjects back up to normal sleep. What happens? Well, here's my nerdy graph. I'm plotting what's called a profile of mood score. Basically, bigger numbers are higher mood. And we get down to the bottom of the graph, it kind of looks like you might need that antidepressant medication and so on. And this is what happens after a single week of deprived sleep. Again, not all-nighters, just like 5 hours or so a night, right? So we need to prioritize our sleep, and that means we need to prioritize our sleep hygiene. I don't want to call anyone out in the room, but how many of you in the middle of the night, if I asked you why aren't you sleeping or what happens when you wake up in the middle of the night, it's because you do this, right? The blue light, the anxiety-provoking information, all your emails, it's not good to look at in the middle of the night. And one of my favorite recommendations, the best happiness-inducing material possession you can give someone is an old-school alarm clock. You know, the old ones that don't talk to the internet, that don't show you what was in the news yesterday? Get one of those for yourself and put your phone very far away so you're not tempted to do this. But all of this is about, top insight number 3, you gotta focus on those healthy habits. And you gotta focus on those healthy habits, especially when things are stressful. I meet a lot of folks in the nonprofit sector who say things like, oh yeah, I exercise and I sleep well until the quarterly report is due, or until that grant deadline's coming up, then I don't sleep at all. And I'm like, no, that's exactly the time that you need all those things even more so you can feel better and perform better. So those are ways we should change our behaviors to feel better. Top insight number 4 is a way that we can change our mindsets to feel better, our thought patterns. And it is that if we want to be happier, we need to find ways to be in the present moment so we can notice all the good stuff. This is something that is kind of in our cultural parlance. We talk a lot about kind of mindfulness and things, but I think it's not cultural practice. We spend a lot of our time not in the present moment, more doing this. Is my favorite physical representation of mind wandering, where you're thinking about that conversation you had with your spouse, or that due date that you have coming up, or your flight. You're anywhere but here. Researchers at Harvard estimate just how much time we spend mind wandering. They do this funny study where they ping people and ask, hey, what are you doing right now? Are you paying attention to what you're doing right now? And how are you feeling? And when researchers do that, they find that people self-report mind wandering, not paying attention to what's going on, just under 50% of the time. It's like 49.8% of the time, which is bad. We're missing half our life. Think about the performance consequences of everybody in your organization not paying attention 49% of the time. Not good. But it also has a happiness cost. The researchers also find that when people self-report mind wandering, even if it's to good stuff, I'm going to this really cool offsite that I'm excited about, I'm like thinking about that, people self-report not being as happy as if they're focused on what they're doing. Even if what you're doing is boring, some boring spreadsheet kind of thing, it's just better to be on task than not. So how do we get back more on task? Well, research gives us a couple ways. One is through the simple act of what scientists, and I guess lay people too, call savoring. Next time you're eating something delicious, listening to a nice piece of music, out in a beautiful scene, pay attention. How would I describe this? In the case of eating something delicious, what does this taste like? What does this feel like? Just turn on your noticing muscles and pay a little bit of attention. It's a practice that's just available to any of you at any point. But there's also a thing we can do to build up our mindfulness muscles over time. And that is the practice of meditation. Some of you in the room might meditate or have heard of others that do. There's lots of different meditation practices, but basically what they all have in common is you commit to focusing on something intentionally, maybe your breath. So you're like, I'm gonna focus on my breath. And if you've ever meditated, you know what happens. Your mind does that thing where it's like, whoop, and it goes, and you try to yank it back on task and it wanders away and you yank it back. Those yank backs are like bicep curls for your focus. And in fact, there's evidence from folks like Hedy Kober at Yale showing that those little bicep curls actually can increase gray matter in regions of your brain that are useful for attention and focus. So you're literally changing your brain, even in cases of like novice meditators meditating for like 5-10 minutes at a time. A powerful practice, not just to focus during meditation, but to focus all during the times that you need to focus. And so those are ways that we can become in the present moment, savor all the good things. But top insight number 4 has this corollary that I think for this crowd might be even more important. Because the research shows that we don't just need to be in the present moment when the present moment's feeling, unicorns and rainbows and great. We also need to be in the present moment when the present moment is feeling kind of yucky. And I don't know about your present moments lately, but some of mine ain't been feeling so good, right? Some of mine have been filled with normative frustration, normative sadness, normative anxiety, right? These are emotions that are good for us. They're good because they're kind of like the alert signal on our car. They tell us what's going on. If we ignore it too much, that's bad. But they don't feel good. And they often kind of can interfere with our performance if we're not careful. And so what do kind of high-achieving type A folks like the folks in this room do? You say, nope, don't have time for that emotion, don't have time to feel frustration, definitely don't have time to feel overwhelm or burnout, I'm just gonna squish that down, right? And we think that works. But does it? Well, researchers have looked at this. Folks like James Gross and his colleagues at Stanford have studied this. And he finds it doesn't really work in the way we think. And it has some bad consequences. One of his studies brings students into the lab and has them do kind of the opposite of that doctor study where they get to watch happy videos, they get to watch really sad videos, things that would make you upset. But James Gross says, whatever you do, pretend that you're not feeling sad. Try to suppress that emotion as much as possible. Subjects can try to do that. Turns out there are consequences. One consequence is that subjects do worse on a memory test. They do worse on a risky decision-making task. Their thinking apparatus isn't working as well because part of their brain is holding down that negative emotion and trying to pretend it's not there. And that has a cost to your innovative thinking. Not great. Also not great for us physically. Even in this short laboratory task, James Gross finds evidence that these subjects show signs of cardiac stress. They're stressing out their cardiac system after just suppressing this like 5-minute sad video. Imagine where we're all gonna be at the end of the year. Like imagine what we have taken on in the last couple of years, right? Not good, right? So we shouldn't suppress our emotions, but that raises the question, how do we get through them? And science has a really great hack. If you take nothing else away from a talk, as is folks in this industry, I think this is the best one. It's a meditation practice you can do to sit with and allow your emotions to just be there. And it goes by a handy acronym of RAIN. It's a practice that's been popularized by the meditation teacher Tara Brach, and the acronym stands for Recognize, Allow, Investigate, and Nurture. We'll kind of go through how this works. So let's say you experience a negative emotion. You read something in the news that really frustrates you. You get an email that makes you feel really scared. You notice, something yucky's happened, negative emotion. And you say, that random yellow lady from the Microsoft conference, she said I could do this rain practice, and you've already achieved the first step, recognize. I'm going through a yucky emotion right now. This doesn't feel good, right? Then you do the hardest step, which is A, allow. You say, all right, I'm gonna sit here with this anxiety, feeling a little frustrated. I'm just gonna allow that feeling to be there just as it is. But you give your brain something to do while you're just sitting with that feeling. And that's the next step, I. You say, okay, what does this feeling feel like in my body? Maybe my chest is getting tight. Maybe my brow is furrowing. Maybe I have a strong craving to eat something, check my email, be anywhere. But this, don't act on this, just notice. That is where my brain and my body goes when I'm feeling pissed off with a side of overwhelmed or sad with a little bit of anxiety, right? The beauty of this investigate step is clinical psychologists will tell us that emotions are like a wave. We'll feel it for a little bit, but if you just sit with your emotion, it'll actually subside and go down. But you don't end there. You end on this last step, N, which is to nurture. You ask, how can I treat myself with self-compassion? What can I take off my plate? What do I need right now? Powerful strategy for those in this room because research suggests that acceptance practices like RAIN can reduce burnout in even the most awful occupations. So it can reduce burnout, for example, in first responders, right, who are dealing, or in palliative care workers, people who are dealing with death on the line. I think this is a strategy that should be your go-to to not just kind of suppress those negative emotions, which doesn't work, but to sit with them, allow them, and use them the way they're supposed to be used. So that is top insight number 4. We ought to be in the present moment, even when the present moment is yucky. And I think as you think about what tools you need to be resilient leaders in the face of the actual world we find ourselves in now, with the actual problems we're facing, this one is gonna be key. Because ultimately, resilience isn't about ignoring your negative emotions. It's not about kind of like pretending everything's fine when it's not fine. It's about saying, hey, this feels yucky, I don't like this, but I can tolerate it. I can learn from it, right? I can see my emotions and figure it out. So really good top insight, be in the present moment, not just when everything's ice cream cones, but also when it's feeling kind of yucky. Now we get to top insight number 5, which I think is really one that follows up on that last practice, that nurture practice of RAIN. Another thought pattern shift that I think we need to engage in to feel better, we need to give ourselves a gift of what you might call self-compassion. Let's talk about the opposite of self-compassion first, probably something that's very familiar to you. Something comes up, you're under deadline, there's a lot to do, something goes wrong. What do you say to yourself in your head? If you're like many people, you might say kind of some nasty things to yourself in your head. You might be very self-critical. And I often joke that if HR could hear the things we say to ourselves in our head, we would all be fired, because we would hopefully, never talk to a coworker the way we talk to ourselves in our heads, right? We can ask, why do we do this? And I think it's not because we're masochists or we hate ourselves. I think we genuinely think that being that self-critical, being that hard on ourselves, being that push is good for our performance, right? It gets us through the tough times. It helps us not make mistakes. It helps us not procrastinate, right? This is our assumption. But one of the things we know in psychology is that a lot of our assumptions are wrong, and here's a case where our assumptions are very wrong. If you do studies of people's self-critical self-talk, you find it makes them perform less well, makes them connect less well to teammates, it increases inflammation. It's just like bad all around. But you might ask, what's the alternative? How do you talk to yourself if you want to be kind to yourself? And that is where we get to strategies of self-compassion. A lot of the great work on self-compassion was done by this researcher, Kristen Neff. She's a professor at UT Austin. If you have trouble with self-compassion, this is a great book to dig into. But she also breaks self-compassion down into 3 very convenient steps, these here: mindfulness, common humanity, and self-kindness. So let's go through these. Starting with mindfulness. You start by noticing there's a problem. You're not feeling so hot right now. I'm feeling like I screwed something up. I'm feeling really overwhelmed. I am at my wit's end. I don't feel good right now. You mindfully notice, recognize what you're actually going through. But then you go to that next step, common humanity. This is the important one. You say, and that's normal. It is normal in my industry to feel overwhelmed given what is on my plate. It is normal in 2025 to feel frustrated or scared or anxious. It's normal in the line of work I do to occasionally need rest, right? You just say, this is a common human experience, and you normalize it. But then again, just like with the rain practice, you don't end there. There's a final step of self-kindness. You say, what can I do to treat myself like a friend? What can I take off my plate? How can I be kind to myself? And this question of how can you treat yourself like a friend, I think is an important one, because sometimes we confuse self-compassion with self-indulgence. We think if we're nice to ourselves, we're just gonna let ourselves off the hook for whatever. We could be just totally messing up or totally not taking care of ourselves. But if you think of how you would talk to a good friend who is actually messing up, you wouldn't scream at them like a drill sergeant, like you scream at yourself in your head, but you also wouldn't let them off the hook. You would get curious. You would go into problem-solving mode. You would say, what is going on? What has happened? How can I fix this? What do you need, right? That's what you say to yourself. So you go from critical drill sergeant mode into good coach who's problem solving and try to fix stuff mode. That's self-compassion. And it turns out it has a whole host of benefits that we wouldn't have known until Kristen Neff's lovely research. One of the things is that self-compassion practices are one of the best tools we have in psychology to reduce the negative effects of terrible experiences, the negative effects of trauma. Kristen Neff has actually studied this in the military. She works with Afghan and Iraqi vets who she independently measures their levels of self-compassion. And she finds that equating for combat experience and equating for the terrible stuff that happens, those vets who actually experience the most self-compassion are kind of nicest to themselves. They end up kind of not getting PTSD, this sort of post-traumatic stress disorder, even though they have the same terrible experiences, but they're not screaming at themselves and thinking that they've done something wrong because they're getting it. That actually reduces the negative effects of trauma. And so I think for a lot of the work that some of you are doing in the room, really great for maybe the folks that you're working with, but also maybe really great for yourself facing such difficult times. Those are the kind of extreme cases of trauma, but self-compassion also works for the little things. It allows you to kind of achieve the goals that you want to achieve. For example, eating a little bit more healthy. It's easier when you're self-compassionate to do stuff that kind of your future self wants you to do because you're not beating yourself up in the moment. Relevant to my students and relevant to all of you who have to write grant proposals and quarterly reports and so on, self-compassion actually reduces procrastination. Why? Again, you're not beating yourself up, so it becomes easier to do the hard things that you need to do. And self-compassion, it turns out, is a fantastic strategy to just build your compassion muscles more generally. So people who are more self-compassionate are more compassionate with the folks on their team, with their spouses, with their kids. If you can be nice to the person that it's hardest to be nice to, namely yourself, then you get really good at being nice to other folks. And so self-compassion, incredible, powerful strategy, but it's one that for, again, very high-achieving folks, very push, push, push yourself folks, can be hard. And so I like when strategies have a clear hack that you can use very practically, very fast. And Kristen Neff has a good one for self-compassion. She recommends before using that self-compassionate self-talk, you use self-compassionate touch. And so we're gonna practice. It's gonna look a little stupid, but we'll do it. Give yourself a little mini hug or a little stroke on the arm. How someone who really cares about you would touch you if you were in a bad situation. And here's a dumb but really beautiful feature of our brain. Our brains don't know who's touching us. They don't know it's you. They think it's this is true in other contexts too, I don't have to get into them, but they don't know it's you. And this means you feel the comfort of a good friend doing the same thing. It's also just a nice cue that you can talk to yourself kindly. So you can go through those 3 steps. Mindfulness. This sucks right now. This is really hard right now. I'm struggling. I messed up, right? Common humanity. But stress is just a part of life. I'm just human. Of course, it makes sense that everybody is going through this in this industry. I'm not alone. Finally, self-kindness. How can I be kind to myself? What do I need to take off my plate, et cetera, et cetera. Super powerful strategies for getting through the tough stuff, having the same bad experiences happen to you, but not having the negative psychological effects. That's self-compassion. Okay, so that's top insight number 5. Give yourself the gift of self-compassion. Now we're gonna switch gears a little bit to how you can be nice to yourself in your work and how you can sort of see your work, even when it's feeling a little overwhelming, as better for you. It is through the practice of finding a way to realign your work with what are called your strengths, right? Probably most of you got into the work that you do because you want it to be purposeful, you want it to be meaning-driven, but we can get lost about what are the parts of our work that does that for us. What kind of makes your job a calling? That's what lots of researchers focus on. And they do that by asking the question, well, when people self-report that their jobs are callings, that they really love their job, what are they doing differently? And it turns out that one of the things they're doing differently is that they might be engaging in what are called your signature strengths during your job. What do I mean? Well, researchers have gone out and they've asked people, what are the values that you can bring to work? What are the different kinds of strengths you can bring to your work? And they've argued that that list of strengths isn't infinite. In fact, if you kind of code them, there tends to be about 24 different kinds of what they call character strengths. And I'll put up the big list here. There are things like engaging in bravery or creativity, humor on the job, loving learning, a sense of zest for life, right? You can kind of see these. And I invite you to kind of read through them, because it turns out that there are individual differences in which one of these resonate for you. They're all good. You know, you might be like, yeah, citizenship, integrity, that's great, but I'm really about perspective, or I'm really about love or spirituality, whatever it is. The one that resonates most with you is what researchers would call your signature strength. It's the one, the research shows, that if you engage with it at work, will actually make you feel like your job is a calling. Even when the bad stuff is happening, you'll still feel like you love your job. Now, you might be like, that is great, but like, how do I bring, for example, if you're the appreciation of beauty or humor or modesty, whatever it is, how do I bring that into my work? How can I find ways to use more of my signature strengths in the actual work that your jobs involve? And this is here where I love the research of Amy Resninsky, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. She studies a practice that she has christened job crafting. And what she means by this is taking whatever job you have and whatever your job description is, the things you have to do, and finding a way to infuse those strengths in as creatively as you can. And the reason I love Amy's work is that she doesn't work with folks in your industry who are doing, I imagine, lots of different creative, problem-solving things that have a lot of independence. She studies job crafting in hospital janitorial staff workers. These are the people who are cleaning the linen in hospital rooms, or when people get sick, they have to clean up vomit, right? This is not a job where you think you'd have a lot of flexibility to bring in things like a zest for life or spirituality or creativity. But she finds that a third of these hospital janitorial staff workers actually self-report that their job is a calling. Interestingly, it's that high, between a quarter and a third. And the ones that really love their job are the ones that job craft. She tells these really beautiful stories. There's one story she tells of a janitorial staff worker who worked in a chemotherapy ward. So if you've been unlucky enough to have to get chemotherapy yourself or know someone that did, you know people get really sick. And so a lot of this guy's job was actually mopping up vomit. That was his job description. But he said, no, that's not my job description. My strengths are humor and social intelligence. My job is to make that patient who's having a really terrible day laugh. And he had like a standard shtick that he did. He would come in and he would say, oh, you vomited, this is a big one, overtime for me, I'm gonna take it really slow. They would laugh just like you're laughing, and he was like, that's my job. She mentioned another staff worker who worked in a coma ward, so this person couldn't interact with patients because those patients were in a coma, but every day she took the art and the plants that were on the wall and moved them around. Her strength was creativity. And she kind of thought that that was helping the patients recover. Not clear medically if that was true, but it gave her a sense of purpose at work that she loved, right? This is job crafting, and if hospital janitorial staff workers can bring those strengths into their work, for sure you can too, and for sure you can get the folks on your teams to do that too. One of the recommendations I often have for leaders is, do you know what the strengths of the folks in your organization are? You know what's on their profiles of their resumes they submitted, but can you dig deeper into what these strengths are? Find those out. Give them opportunities to express them. It might feel a little scary as a leader, but what the data show is you'll just get performance on the actual job description coming out better if people can express those and use them. So that's top insight number 6. You gotta find your strengths, figure out what they are, and figure out a way to put them into practice. Now we get to top insight number 7, the last one. You're almost done your whole Yale class. Deep breath. But this is the hardest one. It's that if we want to become happier, less burned out, we need to become wealthy, but not in money. That's good. You don't have to fundraise. It's not that. You need to become wealthy in time, which unfortunately is harder. This is a concept that lots of social scientists have been paying a lot of attention to, a concept they call time affluence, the subjective sense that you have some free time. It's the opposite sensation of what many of us experience, which is what researchers like Ashley Willens call time famine, where we're literally starving for time. And that word is apt because it turns out that the physiological profile of not having a lot of time looks a lot like famine. You develop things like inflammation, and you're triaging things and so on. And time famine is a huge hit on your well-being. In fact, one of Ashley's studies shows that if you self-report being very time famished, that's as bad a hit on your well-being as if you self-reported being unemployed. A lot of you, if you became unemployed suddenly tomorrow, would say that was a hit on your well-being. Just not having any time is that bad. And that's, a lot of you are making this expression, that's cool, I get it, I'm time famished too. Question is, what can we do about it? The cool thing about time affluence from a psychological perspective is that it's not the objective amount of free time you have, it's the subjective sense that you have some. And that means you can hack it in these interesting ways. You can, for example, buy yourself a little bit of time. Some of you who have some discretionary income have probably at some point gotten takeout, gone out for dinner. That's nice, but you probably didn't frame it as a savings in time. It was. If you went out and bought some pad thai, last night before I flew out here, I came out and with my husband bought some pad thai. That was like noodles I didn't have to cook, I didn't have to clean, I didn't have to look up the recipe of how you make peanut sauce. Probably saved, what, hour and change, hour and 50 minutes? What did I do with that hour and 50 minutes? Did I put it back and invest in myself? You see that switch of kind of giving yourself some time? Powerful hack to spend your discretionary income on getting more time. But an even better one is to make good use of the free time we do have. Time surveys now show that we actually have more free time now than we did 15, 20 years ago, which is shocking to me, but I've seen the data, it's there. Problem is that the chunks of time we have are broken up in very stupid ways. 15, 20 years ago, we had whole 2-hour blocks. Now we got 15 minutes here, 10 minutes there when the Zoom meeting ends early. What the journalist Bridget Schultz has christened time confetti, little pieces of time that are floating around. We don't think they're that valuable, so we just blow them. You scroll through something terrible that's happened in the news. My vice is Reddit. I'll pull out Reddit and go through my Reddit thread. Not good, right? Not good because it doesn't necessarily make me happy, and I'm wasting that 5 minutes, 6 minutes here and there that could be put to good use. And so researchers like Ashley Willens recommend noticing your time confetti when you have these little moments and making what she calls a time confetti wish list. It's not like a to-do list. It's not work emails you have to answer in that time. It's how can you take care of yourself in those 5 minutes? Maybe that's when you text a friend. Maybe that's when you do a little rain meditation, take a deep breath, do the 7-minute New York Times workout, whatever it is. Use that time wisely, and it starts to add up. It also starts to make you feel a little less time famished. And so that's top insight number 7. We gotta find ways to become wealthy in time. I think that's one of the reasons I'm so excited about so many of these technological innovations, because they have the potential to help us here, and that winds up being really important. But look, congratulations, you made it through a whole Yale class. That was awesome, good job. If you're like, that was great, but I want to go deeper without the SAT cost, I get it. We have the whole version of that class online on Coursera.org. If you just Google free Yale happiness class, you'll find it. Lots of folks have taken it, so share it with others. And we also have done a version for young people. So if you have a teenager in your life, free version up there that you could take with them too. And if you're like, I'm really time famished, I do not have time for a whole Yale class, thank you very much. You can listen to my podcast, much shorter, much easier. But I hope I've convinced you that the path to happiness is the path to becoming a more resilient leader and a better performing leader. Hope I've given you some tips to get you there. And thank you for having me.